Zahir, do you feel that this is part of perhaps a broader realization or understanding of how, the budget impacts society, impacts women and things as interlinked as education and health and all of those factors?
Yes, I definitely think so because I think just by having these kinds of policy changes or like these kinds of measures being taken in the budget, I think reflects that the sitting policymakers are aware that the extent of which a certain policy could impact the lives of normal people around them, because generally we view the budget as only increases in prices, like we look at increase in petrol prices, maybe we look at increases in inflation, but then there's also all these various second order effects that happen when parts of the policy are not necessarily grounded in empirical evidence. It has been the dilemma of other developing countries as well, and it has been our dilemma as well, which I'm very pleased to report that things are slowly changing as evidenced by the policies taken within this budget, that we're now slowly and gradually gravitating towards making policies that are more like based in empirical evidence. They're looking into the impact, the actual economic impact, or like the economic impact of these policies on the welfare of the citizen. I think that is supremely important. But I mean, and I can come to this point later, but I think equally important is the fact that we collect data, on all these different indicators. Like we collect data on women's labor force participation, on women's educational attainment, on the overall well-being of mothers. This is where the tax on contraceptives actually comes in, because there's
Mhm.
research, in the US that women's investment in their own employment was raised by nearly 10% due to contraceptives being more accessible to them. And so I think it is this kind of evidence that is so important for us, for developing countries like ours, that is looking for economic growth, to be able to assess what impact the policies are making. And not only that, because there's one way to look at it. We can say, now that we've made a policy, what impact did it have? But then there's this other way where we look at the data, we see what the data is telling us, and then we make our policies around that fact. But for that, we need to have, actual investment into data collection as well, because for all of these indicators, for like, for labor, for wages, for education, for health, we need really good, sound foundation of data to be able to, make these policies that then affect these indicators, not just on the paper, but in fact affect people's lives. Yeah.
So this is exactly what I wanted to come to, because something that really personally interests me is how the budget is made, right? And what does it rely on? And the first step, I would assume, as you've just mentioned, is collection of data, right? It's the analysis, it's the understanding of what the ground realities are, that the budget needs to respond to, and that fiscal decision making needs to really respond to. Could you give me a better idea of how reliable the data is in Pakistan? Because I've been working in different areas, and one of the biggest problems we have is data collection, right? We don't have the protocols, we don't have the standards. We have varying different, one department does it in a different way, another does it in a different way. Um, and then provincial variations. So at the federal level, how can we rely on this data? And what do you feel, when it comes to the economy, health, education, and labor, in all of these areas, can we take sound decisions based on what we're getting?
So this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I recently also posted on X like a very long thread
Mhm.
on
Absolutely.
specifically, because I'll be perfectly honest with you, the main data sets that we work with, are data sets for GDP, the labor force survey, the household economic survey. These are some of the main data sets on which almost all of our policies are based, right? So predominantly all of the human capital related policies are based. And now when I went into like the budget books for the Pakistan's Bureau of Statistics, I just wanted to, this is in fact what I wanted to see, like how much are we spending on data collection? Because like I mentioned before, I think sound data collection forms the foundation of the best policies. Because if our data is not accurate, if it does not reflect actually what's happening in the economy, I doubt we can be able to, come up with policies that address those issues.
Absolutely.
So I I'm afraid to say I don't really have really great news when it comes to the type of data that we're collecting. I mean, I have my reservations with it. So because like I said, policy is as good as the number underlying that policy.
Mhm.
But as far as for example, if even if we talk about GDP now, Federal Board of Revenue's annual targets are basically indexed to GDP. That's what we call autonomous growth, and it predominantly depends on what the GDP number and what the inflation number is going to be like.
Yeah.
And both our inflation numbers and GDP numbers, again, are based off of surveys that are done by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. And I do want to mention here that Pakistan Bureau of Statistics' entire year's budget is just 5 billion rupees. I
Wow.
honestly think that for an organization where like people are going out almost every week to collect inflation data, I just don't think that budget is enough. Like if anybody goes into the books of the organization, they'd be able to see that, that's a place where the government needs to probably prioritize a lot of, spending and a lot of investment, in fact. Because what I've observed is that, for example, for the GDP, for instance, you may remember that the GDP was rebased in 2022 and rebased to 2015, 2016 numbers. And that caused like this large jump in what the GDP figure is. Now, what this means is I'm not saying that rebasing should not be done. What I'm trying to highlight here is the fact that due to that one exercise where we rebase the numbers, and essentially what we were saying was that previously we were calculating or basing our GDP calculations on numbers that were kind of old and did not really reflect the economy. But now that we're rebasing it, we're kind of actually trying to reflect what the economy is actually creating, and that caused a huge jump in GDP. Now, what needs to really be emphasized here is that jump in GDP was not because of any new production that happened. It was just because of the mechanics of the calculation that go into the rebasing of the national accounts, right? And so that kind of highlights how important it is to have accurate data. And now whatever GDP number we measure, we kind of index our target to that, our annual revenue target to that. And what that means is that what we're saying is essentially that this is the amount of GDP that we expect to gain in 2027. And therefore, this part of it should come in as revenue. But how are we measuring that in reality, right? So, like, for example, if we did talk about agriculture, for the federal capital, like livestock is part of the agriculture income tax that is supposed to be collected by the federal capital, basically by the FBR. But if you go into the survey data and you look at how those numbers have been created, so for example, if you're saying that livestock, and I have the numbers right here, I think livestock, like the 14.6% of the GDP is coming from livestock. So livestock alone, so livestock alone contributes 14.6% to our annual GDP, right? Wow. And so, but when you go into the numbers, you see that how do we get to that figure? How do we get to the amount of actual livestock? Like how the exact figure, that's based off of a survey that was done 20 years ago, like in 2006. Oh my God, wow. The last livestock survey was done in 2006. And since then, we've essentially been extrapolating that data to now today say that, yes, livestock contributes 14.6% to the GDP. But I mean, for PBS, an institution whose mandate it is to collect that data, if it has been so hard to be able to get at the actual number, I mean, I doubt that it is easier to be able to generate revenue from that, in the quantum as the contribution to the GDP. And that is just one example, right? And so while I'm not saying that, those numbers, what I'm trying to say from this conversation is that we need to invest a lot more in how we collect our data, right? Yeah. Similarly, for our household economic survey, the HIES that the PBS does, that has also, I think this one has been published after a gap of 6 years. So the last one we had was in 2019, and now we have the next one. Same is the case with poverty. So the point here is that, we're making policies every year, we're making the budget every year, but we're basing it off of numbers that isn't really measuring on a year-to-year basis what's happening in the economy, right? And so I think that's an area where substantial improvement and investment needs to happen before we can expect, real policies to create real change.
Act Pakistan, advocating change together, a Dawn Media initiative.